He thought the monster had returned for his horse, a nightmare reborn in the shadows of the forest. He raised his axe, ready to end it once and for all. The truth, however, was far more terrifying. This is their story. The deep woods of the Wyoming territory were supposed to be Jedediah Stone's sanctuary, but today, they had become a nightmare. He burst through a thicket of ferns, his heart hammering against his ribs, his heavy wood axe gripped tightly in his hands. 50 yards ahead, in a sun-dappled clearing, was the scene he had prayed he would never see again. The colossal python, the ancient guardian of the Serpent River, was back. And it had his horse. Ghost, his magnificent white stallion, was caught in the creature's massive coils. The horse wasn't being crushed, not yet, but it was trapped, its eyes wide with terror, unable to move. The serpent's massive head was reared up, its gaze fixed not on the horse, but on something deeper in the woods. A low, menacing hiss vibrating through the air. For a single, paralyzing second, all of Jed's hard-won peace vanished. The memory of their last encounter, the feeling of his horse's ribs cracking, the stench of his own fear, it all came flooding back. He didn't see a complex creature. He saw a monster. He saw a threat to the only family he had left. The fragile truce they had formed months ago was broken. With a roar of pure, protective fury, he charged. He was not a man of reason anymore. He was a guardian, a protector, an avenger. He raised the axe high, its polished blade glinting in the slivers of sunlight, his entire being focused on a single, deadly purpose: to sever the head from the body of the beast that dared to threaten his world again. The battle he thought was over had only just begun, and this time, he would not hesitate. This time, he would finish it. But to understand the fury in Jedediah's charge, one had to understand the profound peace that had preceded it. The 6 months following their first encounter with the river serpent had been a time of quiet healing. The nightmares of the war and of the fever had begun to fade, replaced by the simple, grounding rhythm of life on his remote homestead. He had rebuilt his cabin, planted a garden, and his days were filled not with sorrow, but with a quiet, contented purpose. His constant companion, Ghost, was fully healed, his brilliant white coat a stark, beautiful contrast to the deep greens and browns of the Wyoming wilderness. The bond between them, forged in terror and tempered by trust, was now absolute. They were more than just a man and his horse. They were two survivors who had found a second chance at a peaceful life, a life they guarded fiercely. Their only connection to the outside world was the monthly ride to the small, dusty town of Havens Point for supplies. It was on one of these trips that the first shadow of a new darkness fell upon their quiet world. The town was buzzing with news, the kind that traveled fast on the frontier, a mix of fact, rumor, and fear. A westbound supply wagon, belonging to a wealthy merchant, had been brutally attacked and raided a week prior, in the treacherous northern pass. The sheriff's posse had found the wagon splintered, the goods stolen, and the guards killed. It was attributed to a new, ruthless gang of bandits led by a man the locals were beginning to call the Ghost, for his ability to strike and vanish without a trace. Jedediah listened, his old soldier's instincts making the hairs on his neck stand up, but the conflict felt a world away from his secluded valley. But there was one detail, a small, tragic footnote to the story, that stuck with him. The merchant had been traveling with his family. His wife was among the dead, and their young daughter, a girl of about 8 or 9, was missing. The posse had searched for days, but had found no trace. Most assumed the worst, that she had been taken by the bandits or had perished in the harsh wilderness. The story of the lost child, a ghost in the vast, unforgiving landscape, resonated with Jedediah's own past. He found himself thinking of her, a small, innocent soul lost in the wild. As he and Ghost made the long ride home, a new, somber watchfulness settled over him. He scanned the horizon, not just for game or weather, but for any sign of a small, lost figure. He was a man who knew all too well the pain of losing a child, and the thought of another family's tragedy unfolding so close to his sanctuary was a deeply unsettling premonition. The peace he had worked so hard to build suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable, as if the darkness of the world was slowly, inevitably, beginning to creep back towards his door. And now, that fragile peace was being shattered. The monster had returned, or so he believed. His mind, clouded by the traumatic memory of their first battle and fueled by a father's protective instinct, saw only a repeat of the nightmare. He crashed through the undergrowth, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His entire focus narrowed to the horrifying scene in the clearing ahead. He saw a predator and its prey. He did not see the truth. He reached the clearing, his heavy axe a familiar, deadly weight in his hands. Ghost was still trapped, his panicked whinnies echoing through the trees. A sound that was like a physical blow to Jedediah. The great python, its massive body a wall of coiled muscle, did not even turn to face him. Its entire, intense focus was directed deeper into the woods, its head raised, its forked tongue tasting the air, a low, guttural hiss vibrating from its throat. It was not the relaxed posture of a hunter savoring its catch. It was the tense, vigilant stance of a guardian on high alert. But Jedediah, blinded by fury and the roaring in his own ears, could not read the signs. He saw only his friend in the grip of his mortal enemy. The memory of his wife's gift, the years of silent companionship, the fear of being truly, utterly alone again, it all coalesced into a single, burning point of rage. He let out a roar, a sound meant to challenge, to draw the beast's attention, to force a confrontation. "Get away from him!" he bellowed, his voice raw with a grief that had transformed into violence. He charged the final few feet and swung the axe. A powerful, desperate arc aimed not to kill, but to warn, to drive the creature away. It was a show of force, a declaration that he was here, that he would fight. The blade struck a low-hanging branch just above the snake, showering splinters and leaves onto its scaly hide. The serpent flinched, not from the blow, but from the sudden, loud noise, and for the first time, it turned its massive head to look at him. There was no malice in its ancient, yellow eyes. There was something else, a flicker of what looked like frustration, annoyance. As if he, Jedediah, was a fool, an ignorant child interrupting a matter of far greater importance. The creature let out another hiss, this one sharper, more insistent, a sound that seemed to say, "Not now, you fool. There are bigger dangers here." It jerked its head, not towards him, but back towards the shadows of the forest, as if desperately trying to make him understand the real threat. But all Jedediah understood was that the monster was still holding his horse. The misunderstanding was complete. He took a firmer grip on his axe, his knuckles white, his mind preparing for another, more lethal strike. He saw the serpent's coils tighten slightly around Ghost and interpreted it as a threat, not as what it truly was. An involuntary flinch. A mother trying to quiet a child in the face of danger. The tragedy was not that they were enemies. The tragedy was that, in this very moment, they were supposed to be allies. But only one of them knew it. And the other was about to make a terrible, fatal mistake. Jedediah raised the axe high above his head, the polished steel glinting in the dappled forest light. All the pain, all the fury, all the protective instinct in his soul was channeled into this one, final, lethal blow. He was aiming for the serpent's neck, a spot just behind its massive head, a killing strike he had practiced 1,000 times in his mind. He took a deep, ragged breath, his muscles coiling for the attack. Ghost's life depended on this. His own sanity depended on this. But just as he was about to bring the axe down with all his might, something made him hesitate. A single, small, and utterly illogical detail that his trackers I had registered. The serpent's coils. They were wrapped around Ghost, yes, but they were not constricting. It was not the crushing, bone-breaking grip he had witnessed in their first, horrific encounter. This was different. It was a firm, heavy hold, more like a living cage than a tool of execution. Ghost was trapped, terrified, but he could still breathe. The serpent was not trying to kill him. It was simply holding him. The realization was a splash of icy water on his white-hot rage. It made no sense. Why would a predator capture its prey only to hold it? He lowered the axe slightly, his brow furrowed in a deep, confused scowl. And in that moment of hesitation, the world changed. His focus shifted from his own blind fury to the scene before him. He truly looked at the serpent, not as a monster, but as a creature with intent. He saw its eyes again. They were not locked on him, the immediate threat with the axe. They were darting nervously, urgently, past him, into the deep, dark woods from which he had just emerged. He followed its gaze. At first, he saw nothing but the familiar shadows of the pines and ferns. But then he heard it, a sound that his own roaring anger had previously drowned out. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves that was not made by the wind. They were not alone. A cold dread, a feeling far older and more chilling than his anger, began to creep up his spine. He was a soldier. He knew the feeling of being watched, of walking into an ambush. The great serpent let out another hiss, but this time it was different. It was low, guttural, and directed not at him, but at the unseen presence in the trees. It was a warning, a clear, unmistakable challenge to a hidden enemy. And Jedediah, in a moment of stunning, world-altering clarity, finally understood. The serpent hadn't captured his horse to kill it. It had captured his horse to stop it, to prevent them from blundering into a danger that was far greater than itself. The horse was not the prey. The horse was bait, or rather, an anchor to keep Jedediah here, to force him to see the real threat. The roles were reversed in a horrifying instant. He was not Ghost's savior. In this moment, this ancient, terrifying creature of the river was trying to be his. It was a warning, a desperate, interspecies communication that he had almost silenced forever with a single swing of his axe. The enemy was not in front of him. The enemy was behind him. Jedediah stood frozen, the heavy axe feeling like an extension of his own clenched, trembling muscles. The entire world had narrowed to this single, impossible standoff. The serpent, the monster he was about to execute, was not his enemy. It was a sentinel, a guardian. And its warning was as clear and as cold as the sweat that now trickled down his spine, mingling with the grime on his weathered skin. He slowly, almost imperceptibly, turned his head, his eyes scanning the dense, shadowy forest behind him. The forest that had felt like a sanctuary just minutes ago now seemed alive with a hidden, malevolent presence. His years as a soldier in the dense, claustrophobic woods of the East, his time as a trapper on the vast, open plains, had taught him to recognize the subtle signs of a predator's hunt, a silence that was too deep, a stillness that was unnatural, the sudden absence of birdsong. And he felt it now, a suffocating blanket of imminent danger, an unseen gaze that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The great python remained coiled around Ghost, but its grip was no longer one of constriction. It was a living anchor, a heavy, unmovable weight, preventing the terrified horse from bolting and giving away their position to the unseen threat. The serpent's massive head was still raised, its unblinking yellow eyes fixed on a specific thicket of ancient, gnarled oak trees about 100 yards away. It was from there that the feeling of dread was emanating, a cold spot in the otherwise warm forest clearing. Jedediah's mind raced, a maelstrom of confusion and dawning horror, trying to piece together this impossible puzzle. The raid on the supply wagon, an event he'd heard about in town and dismissed as distant trouble. The story of the missing child, a tragedy that had tugged at the frayed edges of his own grief. And now this ancient creature, acting not out of hunger, but out of a strange, intelligent, protective instinct that defied all natural law he had ever known. He remembered the story from town, how the bandits were led by a man called the Ghost, for his ability to strike and vanish without a trace. But what if the real Ghost was not a man, but a terrified, orphan child, hiding in the one place no one would ever think to look, the territory of a legendary river serpent? It was a wild, desperate thought, but in a world that had already shown him a creature of impossible size, what was one more impossibility? It was in that moment of horrifying realization that he saw them. At first, it was just a flicker of movement in the deep shadows, a shift in the pattern of light and dark that did not belong. Then, the shapes resolved. 3 men, moving like wraiths through the undergrowth, their rifles held low and ready. They were not cowboys or trappers. Their movements were too silent, too predatory. They were hunters of a different kind, their faces hard and cruel. And leading them, a man whose presence radiated a cold reptilian focus that made even the great serpent seem warm-blooded. Silas Cain. The name hit Jedediah like a physical blow. Silas Cain. A man whose reputation was a dark legend whispered around campfires across 3 territories. He was not just a hunter. He was a collector of the rare and the monstrous. A man whose vast wealth allowed him to indulge in the cruelest of sports. Jedediah had seen his handiwork once before. Years ago, on the carcass of a massive grizzly bear. It hadn't been killed cleanly. It had been tormented, weakened over days by a weapon Cain was infamous for. A custom-made harpoon, its head wickedly barbed, its tip coated in a slow-acting venom derived from the poison glands of desert lizards. A poison that didn't kill quickly, but induced a state of agonizing, frenzied paralysis. This was the plot twist, the collision of 2 terrible stories, the horrifying, gut-wrenching truth of the scene before him. He looked at the serpent, at its strange, spastic writhing, and he understood. He looked closer, and he saw it, a detail his own rage had blinded him to. There, on the creature's underside, was an old, festering wound. The flesh around it was swollen and angry, and protruding from the center, dark and ugly, was the splintered wooden shaft of a large, broken harpoon, carved with Cain's signature interlocking diamond pattern. This colossal serpent, this magnificent, ancient creature, was not a monster. It was a victim of a man's cruel sport. It was dying. The venom was slowly, agonizingly, turning its powerful body into a prison of its own making. The frenzied rage, the violent spasms, it was the desperate, last stand of a creature being consumed by a poison it could not fight. It hadn't attacked Ghost out of malice. It had lashed out at anything that moved, a blind reaction to the storm of pain and confusion raging within its dying brain. And then, Jedediah saw her. Just for a second, a flicker of movement behind the gnarled roots of the largest oak tree, the very spot the serpent had been watching. A small, pale face, framed by a mass of tangled dark hair, a pair of wide, terrified eyes. It was the girl, the lost child, Lyra. She was real, and she was hiding in the heart of the serpent's new, makeshift lair. In a moment of pure, tragic irony, the dying, venom-stricken creature had become her only protector. It had sensed the approach of its own killer, and had done the only thing it could to protect the small, helpless creature it had taken under its care. It had created a loud, violent, and terrifying diversion. It had used Ghost, Jedediah's most precious thing, as a shield, a noisy distraction to draw attention away from the real target. The entire dynamic of the battlefield had been turned on its head. Jedediah was no longer a man fighting a monster to save his horse. He was a man caught between a ruthless killer, a wounded, dying, and yet profoundly protective beast, and the innocent child they were both, in their own desperate ways, trying to control. Silas Cain had not yet seen him. His focus, and that of his men, was entirely on the trees, on flushing out their small, terrified prey. They were getting closer. Jedediah knew he had only a few seconds to make a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could try to slip away, to save himself and Ghost, and leave the child to her fate. It was the logical choice, the sane choice, a choice the old, broken Jedediah might have made. But he looked at the magnificent, wounded creature before him, at the silent, desperate plea in its ancient eyes. He thought of his own lost child, of the gnawing, endless guilt of not being able to protect his family. He thought of Alara, and the promise he had made to her to live a life of honor. He could not, would not, let another child be taken while he stood by and did nothing. He was a soldier. He was a protector. That was a part of him that had never died. The choice was made. He would not run. He would stand with the serpent. He would fight for the child. He tightened his grip on his axe, the worn wood, a familiar, solid comfort. He was no longer just a grieving man. He was a guardian, and the hunt was about to begin. The choice once made, settled in Jedediah's soul with the cold, hard finality of a chambered round. He would fight, but how? He was one man, armed with a simple wood axe, against 3 professional hunters armed with rifles. A direct assault was not just suicide. It was a fool's errand that would leave both the child and his horse defenseless. The thought of Lyra falling into the hands of a man like Silas Cain, a man who saw living creatures as mere trophies, was a horror that eclipsed his own fear of death. He looked at the scene before him, not as a combatant, but as a general assessing a battlefield. His mind, honed by years of warfare, frantically searching for a tactical advantage, a weakness, any sliver of an opportunity. His gaze fell upon the 3 key players in this deadly tableau. First, Cain and his men, their attention focused entirely on the woods, their arrogance, their greatest weakness. They did not yet know he was there. Second, the child, Lyra, a terrified but silent ghost, hidden in the roots of the ancient oak. Her silence was her shield, a fragile defense that could be shattered at any moment. And third, the serpent, the magnificent, dying creature, a whirlwind of agony and unpredictable power. It was the greatest danger on the field, a chaotic, uncontrollable force. And in that chaos, Jedediah saw his only, insane, desperate chance. He could not defeat Cain and his men in a gunfight. But what if he didn't have to? What if he could unleash a force of nature upon them so terrifying, so primal, that their rifles and their numbers would mean nothing? The serpent was a prisoner of its own pain, lashing out blindly. But what if he could aim it? The idea was madness, a thought born from the very edge of desperation. To save Ghost, he had to get the coils off of him. To save the child, he needed to create a diversion so profound it would allow her to escape. To do both, he needed the serpent. He needed to free it, not from his own threat, but from the source of its agony. He had to remove the harpoon. The sheer, suicidal folly of the plan was almost laughable. To approach a dying, thrashing, colossal serpent, a creature that had already tried to kill him, not with a weapon, but with the intent to perform a delicate, dangerous operation, was a gamble that defied all reason. He would have to move into its striking distance. He would have to touch it, to inflict a new, sharp pain upon it in the hope of curing the old one. He would have to trust that the creature, in its primal mind, could somehow understand his intent. Every instinct for self-preservation he had ever learned screamed at him that this was the path to a quick and brutal death. But then he looked at Ghost, his labored, shallow breaths a constant, desperate metronome, counting down the final seconds of his life. He looked towards the woods, where he could see Cain's men beginning to spread out, a tightening noose around the child's hiding place. And he knew that the path of logic, the path of self-preservation, was also the path of certain failure and unbearable regret. He thought of his wife, Ilera, of the promise he had made to her to live a life of honor. And he knew what honor demanded. It demanded this. This one, insane, all-in act of faith. This was his all-in moment. The moment he chose not the path of a soldier, but the path of a healer, a gambler, a madman. He took his heavy axe, the symbol of his violent intent, and with a quiet, deliberate motion, he laid it on the ground. He then unbuckled his gun belt, letting it fall with a soft thud into the mud. He was now unarmed, vulnerable, an act of ultimate, insane trust, a message sent not to the men in the woods, but to the creature before him. He held up his empty hands, palms forward, and began to walk slowly, cautiously, into the heart of the danger zone. He began to speak, his voice low and calm, a soothing murmur that was almost a prayer. He was not speaking to a monster. He was speaking to a fellow parent, a fellow guardian. He spoke of the pain, of the poison, of the man in the woods who was their common enemy. He told her he was not there to harm her, but to help. The serpent watched him approach, its great head rising, its hiss a low, warning rumble, its body still trembling with painful spasms. But the frenzied, blind thrashing seemed to lessen slightly. Its ancient, yellow eyes, which had been clouded with a storm of agony, now held a flicker of confused, cautious curiosity. Jedediah did not stop. He was committed now, walking a tightrope over a canyon of death. He was gambling everything: his life, his horse's life, the child's life, on the hope that this ancient creature, in its final, desperate moments, could understand not just the language of violence, but the universal language of a shared, parental desperation. He had chosen his path. He would be a protector, not a destroyer, and he would live or die by that choice. He was now just feet away from the festering wound and from the serpent's deadly, gaping fangs. He could feel the heat radiating from its fevered skin, smell the foul stench of infection and venom. He reached the creature's side, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He knelt in the muddy water, his movements slow, deliberate. He placed one hand gently, respectfully, on the creature's massive, quivering body, a gesture of reassurance. And with the other, he gripped the splintered, poison-soaked shaft of Silas Kane's harpoon. He braced himself for the explosion of pain and violence that was sure to follow, and with a final, whispered apology, he began to pull. The moment Jedediah's fingers closed around the harpoon shaft, the world seemed to hold its breath. The air grew thick, heavy, charged with a primal, electric tension. The great serpent mother went utterly still, her massive body coiling slightly, a mountain of muscle preparing to either strike or shatter. Her ancient, yellow eyes, no longer clouded with the fog of agony, were now focused on him with a terrifying, laser-like intensity. She was watching him, judging him, her mind, a consciousness forged over a century of survival, trying to decipher the impossible act of this strange, two-legged creature. Was this a new form of torture? Or was it, as his calm voice and gentle touch suggested, something else entirely? Jedediah met her gaze. In that moment, he felt a strange, profound connection, a silent communication that transcended species. He saw in her eyes not just a beast, but a sovereign being, a matriarch of this ancient river, a guardian of a sacred trust. He sent a silent prayer, a plea not to a distant god, but directly to her. "Let me help you." He tightened his grip, the splintered wood digging into his palms, and with a grunt that tore from the very depths of his soul, he pulled. A sound of pure, unadulterated agony, a high-pitched, screaming hiss that was almost a shriek erupted from the serpent. Its body convulsed in a massive, violent spasm, a wave of pure, convulsive power that threw Jedediah backward into the muddy water. The coils around Ghost tightened one last, brutal, involuntary time, and the horse went completely limp, its head slumping into the shallows, a final, shuddering breath escaping its lungs. For a single, horrifying second, Jedediah thought he had failed, that his act of compassion had delivered the final death blow to them all. The serpent's massive head whipped around, its fangs bared, its mouth agape, ready to strike him down in its blind agony. Jed scrambled back, his arms raised in a futile attempt to shield himself. He closed his eyes, bracing for the end, but the strike never came. As the harpoon came free in a torrent of dark, venomous blood, the source of the creature's torment was gone. The frenzied, insane rage in its eyes faded, replaced by a deep, profound exhaustion. The violent spasms ceased. The great coils, the instruments of death, went slack, uncoiling with a slow, heavy sigh from Ghost's lifeless-looking body. The serpent, its energy utterly spent, collapsed, its massive head resting on the muddy ground, its breathing slow and deep. It was not dead, but it was defeated, not by violence, but by an act of impossible empathy. Jed did not waste a moment. He ignored the colossal, wounded creature now lying just feet from him and scrambled to Ghost's side, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. "No, no, no," he whispered, his hands frantically searching for a sign of life. He pressed his ear to the horse's chest, praying, pleading with the ghosts of his wife and son to intervene, to grant him this one miracle. For a long, terrible moment that stretched into an eternity, there was nothing but a cold, wet silence. And then he felt it, a single, faint, fluttering beat, followed by another, stronger one. Ghost was alive, barely. Jedediah worked with a desperate, focused energy. He cleared his horse's airway, pumped his powerful legs, and spoke to him, his voice a constant stream of encouragement and love. He knew, without looking, that the great serpent was watching him. He could feel her ancient gaze on his back. There was no threat between them now, only a shared, exhausted peace on a battlefield where no one had truly won, but where, against all odds, no one had lost either. It was then that a sharp, angry shout cut through the clearing. "There he is! Get the girl!" Silas Kane and his men had finally broken through the undergrowth, their rifles raised. They had not seen the drama that had just unfolded. They saw only their target, the small, terrified face of Lyra, peeking out from behind the oak tree. As they advanced, the serpent mother, with a surge of renewed, protective fury, raised her massive head and let out a deafening, terrifying roar, a clear challenge that momentarily stunned the hunters. In that split second of hesitation, Jedediah acted. He leaped on a ghost bareback. The horse, weak but responding to his master's urgent command, struggled to its feet. Jed galloped towards the oak tree, swooping down to pull the terrified Lyra up into the saddle in front of him. They were exposed, a perfect target. But the serpent mother, in a final, incredible act of allegiance, moved to defend her allies. She surged forward, her massive body a living, writhing wall between Kane's men and the escaping horse. She was not just protecting her own young anymore. She was protecting theirs. The hunters, faced with the full, terrifying might of the enraged serpent, were thrown into chaos. It gave Jedediah the time he needed. He and Ghost, carrying the small, precious girl, disappeared into the dense woods, leaving Kane to face the righteous fury of the creature he had so cruelly tormented. 3 months later, Jedediah, Ghost, and Lyra stood on a high ridge, looking down at the Serpent River. Ghost was fully healed, the memory of his ordeal visible only in a few pale scars that crisscrossed his magnificent white coat. Lyra, no longer a terrified, silent ghost, was now a bright, chattering child, the light and laughter having returned to her eyes. She had been reunited with her grandparents in a town to the north, but had insisted on this one final journey to say goodbye. Jedediah had never returned to that specific bend in the river. It was a sacred place now, a place he respected as another's home. He had not just won a battle that day. He had learned a profound lesson that had reshaped his very soul. He had learned that the line between man and monster is sometimes blurred by pain, and that the fiercest battles are often fought by those who are simply trying to protect their family. As they turned to leave, he saw a flicker of movement by the river's edge far below. He raised his spyglass, his hands steady. It was the great serpent mother. She was no longer a creature of agony, but one of majestic grace, her massive body gliding effortlessly through the water, the sunlight glinting off her healing scales. And slithering behind her, making their clumsy, first journey from the hidden crevice into the wide, welcoming river, were dozens of tiny, newly hatched snakes. Her family was safe, and so, in its own strange, new way, was his. Jedediah lowered his spyglass, a deep, genuine smile gracing his features for the first time in 3 long years. He had faced a monster from a nightmare and had discovered not an enemy, but a fellow guardian. In the heart of the wild, he had not lost a friend. He had found a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to protect the ones you love. He had found a lost child and guided her home. And in doing so, he had finally, truly, begun to heal himself. He reached down and ruffled Lyra's hair, his heart full. The lonely trapper was no longer alone. He had a new story to tell, a new memory to cherish, a new reason to ride into the sunrise.